Good morning, you guys. It's your boy Bill Mahari here, represent Mahari Nation Sports Podcast. Much love to the entire LDBC and the entire basketball community. If you want more basketball content, tune in to Basketball Conversations every Friday night, 9 p.m. Central Time. This is where we discuss basketball-related topics, news, debates, and everything else in the world of basketball. So, with no further ado, let's get down to it, man. Then, you know what, bro? 2020 has been a very horrible year for basketball fans, guys. I mean, it's been a really been a tough year considering what's been going on with the pandemic, basically shutting down the entire NBA season until basically resuming it. But the people that we have lost this year, man, have been it's just been very tragic. Going back to David Stern, Kobe Bryant, Jerry Sloan, Wes Unseld. You know what I mean? And then this week we've lost Lute Olson, we lost Clifford Robinson, and yesterday morning, salute to Ticket TV and LVZ, for breaking, the story too, and also ESPN broke the story too as well. Legendary coach of Georgetown, John Thompson, tragically died yesterday at the age of 78. This was a guy that was one of the greatest college basketball coaches of all time and became the first African American coach to win to win a major collegiate championship in basketball. All right. And this was a guy, let me just put it like this. There are certain coaches that are great at what they do. And there is much more to the element of just the X's and O's. You have to have the ability to lead young men, direct young men, and guide them to success. And to me, all these things represent what John Thompson was all about. But the bigger thing about what John Thompson was is that he was a guy that stood firm in his beliefs and basically was a guy who was one of the biggest voices of civil rights and equality for African Americans. You know what I'm saying? This was a guy that voiced all those things while he was doing his job as a head coach. And when you look back at John Thompson's life, growing up in D.C., he practiced, Roman Catholic Christianity, and he pretty much grew up, playing sports, and he went to Providence, College, where he played on the 1963 NIT championship, and was part of the first Providence team to make it to the NCAA tournament as a senior in 1974, and when he went into the NBA in 1964, he was drafted third round by the Boston Celtics and played 2 seasons during the Celtic dynasty with Bill Russell, Red Auerbach, the Tom Sanders, Sam Jones and KC Jones, Job Havlicek, those guys. But he only played 2 years there, and by the time his playing days of basketball came to an end, um, he pretty much decided that he wanted to be a coach. But living in Boston really gave John Thompson a bigger perspective about the issues of racism and bigotry involving Black people in this country, and seeing what Bill Russell went through in his time in Boston gave him a broader perspective of what he had to do to combat against the racism that was going on in the '60s and still going on today. And when he retired as a player, he moved back to DC and started his coaching career at St. Anthony's High School in DC, and he racked up 122 victories in basically his 6 seasons there. And after coaching St. Anthony's, he accepted the job of coaching Georgetown University in DC. Now, let's put this in proper perspective here, okay? Nobody knew what Georgetown University was. Honestly, I don't think even if you ask anybody if Georgetown even had a basketball program, they would probably just laugh at you back in the day. Many people had the perception that Georgetown was pretty much a law school type of university that was not known for sports programs. And when John Thompson came into to Georgetown back in 1973, immediately he began building the pieces of constructing one of the greatest college basketball programs of all time. And within 2 years, he helped lead Georgetown to their first trip to the NCAA tournament in 1975. Then you fast forward to 1982. In 1982 is when Georgetown was finally well known on the national stage. And you could go all the way back to towards the late 70s when John Thompson recruited his biggest star yet, which was Patrick Ewing from from basically coming out of Jamaica. Okay, actually, I'm sorry. Patrick Ewing actually came from Massachusetts, but nonetheless, but the the recruiting of Patrick Ewing paved the way to what Georgetown became in the 80s. Um, when you think about Georgetown in the 80s, you think of Sleepy Floyd, you think of Fred Brown, Reggie Williams, Michael Graham, but Patrick Ewing was the big noticeable figure in Georgetown basketball. And when John Thompson finally had the players that he could play with, that he could basically play on the floor, all right, he finally finally had the personnel to finally show most of his intimidation. Okay, he was an opposing figure. Listen, when you were coaching against John Thompson, okay, he stood it at 6'10", with weighing 269 pounds, with a towel on basically on the right side of his shoulder. Okay, and he was basically an opposing figure against referees, against other coaches. I mean, this guy was an intimidating figure, and he didn't want to be known as the main villain, but he embellished that. But what people didn't understand about John Thompson was is that John Thompson was a guy who cared about his players very, very heavily. I remember reading a lot of articles where he would basically tell his players that he would have to commit themselves to the classroom, teaching, getting the necessary, tutoring needed to help his players, pass their classes and learn all the important things they're going to need to be successful when they leave college, especially how to, dress, how to use certain utensils, all these things were pretty much the things that he did. That's what I'm talking about when I talk about, coaches that do more than just beyond the X's and O's. And John Thompson certainly did that during his time. But he made his first national championship game back in 1982, and going against the North Carolina Tar Heels, led by James Worthy, Sam Perkins, uh, Matt Doherty, Jimmy Black, and obviously the great Michael Jordan. And when you look back at that game, John Thompson's motive is, we're going to intimidate our opposition. We're going to, reject everything. And when you were going against Patrick Ewing, when you were trying to go to the basket against Patrick Ewing, you better come strong against him, or he's going to send it to the nosebleeds. And I remember about at least 5 goal 10s in that game in 82 in the first half that basically equated to 10 points, on goal 10s. I mean, that was Georgetown basketball. Like any layup, any shot on the inside, they was going to send it back. You were not going to score inside in the paint. But ultimately, the game went down to the wire with 32 seconds to go after, Sleepy Floyd hit the jumper to give the Hoyas a 1-point lead. Then North Carolina rotated the ball to a wide open Michael Jordan, who hit the game winning jumper, which began his legendary career. And sadly, Fred Brown mistakenly thought that we had a teammate right beside him, but then threw the ball in the winning hands of James Worthy, and which pretty much ended the game. But you heard a lot of screaming fans, but I could tell you this: John Thompson was well heard, during the game. Screaming at his players, screaming at the referees. I mean, when you had that towel right beside him, I mean, it was going to be drenched in sweat by the time it was all said and done. But eventually, they made up for the loss in 82 by capturing their first national championship back in 1984. That year, the Hoyas finished that regular season with 34 victories. And, there was a team that was pretty much led by freshman forward Reggie Williams, junior Patrick Ewing, you know what I'm saying? You had David Wingate, and then you also had the intimidator Michael Graham, who was one of the big time enforcers. You know what I mean? You were not getting anything easy when you were going against Ewing and Graham together as a duo. All right, and they really put a lot of fear in a lot of these teams, man. And I'm gonna say this though too. When you look back at the Big East, during the 80s, the Big East was the most loaded conference you'll ever find in all of college basketball. The teams that faced each other, I mean, they were not just really good teams. They were national championship quality teams. Teams like Lou Carnesecca's St. John's teams, Jim Boeheim's Syracuse teams. Um, you also had who else? You also had John Thompson in the mix too. All right. I mean, you had Villanova with Raleigh Massimino, and which I'm going to get to in a few moments here. I mean, it was just teams that was just loaded from top to bottom. You know what I'm saying? It was just a beautiful era of Big East basketball. When you combine that with North Carolina and Duke in the ACC, and Indiana in the Big Ten, UCLA and Arizona later on in the decade. I mean, I'm telling you, the 80s of college basketball will go down as the greatest period of college basketball ever, beyond beyond bar none. And you cannot argue with me about that. But back to John Thompson. In '84, he helped them lead to the national championship. And when he was asked about how does it feel to become the first, black coach to win the national championship, he basically said, "Hey, I'm the first coach from New England to win the national championship." Because there was a period of time where a lot of coaches were pretty much humbled and pretty much accepting like I'm just lucky to be here. When John Thompson was the coach of Georgetown, he said, "Listen, I earned my way. I deserve to be the coach of Georgetown. Listen. I am more qualified to be any other coach, in the country. All right. I know I'm just kind of paraphrasing, but you get my drift about that. John Thompson walked around like, listen, I deserve to be a head coach. Listen, I'm not just going to sit here and be humble always all the time. I deserve to be head coach. Just that boldness and that confidence of John Thompson is what made him such an outstanding figure for a lot of the people. All right, but in '85, they went back to the national championship game, and Patrick Ewing was pretty much a senior that year. All right, and by red hot shooting from Raleigh Massimino's Villanova team, which shot an NCAA tournament record 79% from the field in the second half, where they were pretty much held on the ball, making every single shot that they took. All right. It took a perfect game to beat Georgetown in one of the biggest upsets in NCAA championship history. Okay. Listen, Georgetown had beaten Villanova twice that year, and it took a perfect game to beat Georgetown in the national championship game. All right. And as usual, John Johnson was kind of gracious in defeat and, gave credit where was due. But but then later on in the decade, he coached, Alonzo Mourning. He coached Dikembe Mutombo. That was pretty much one of my favorite shot blocking duos of all time. The John Thompson was responsible for the culture of Hoya paranoia. He was pretty much responsible for creating this atmosphere, this intimidating atmosphere among opponents and along with other opposing fans. But they played a style of basketball that was very intimidating, that was very physical, not dirty. They didn't play dirty. They didn't try to, bend the rules or anything like that. They just played good, honest, physical basketball. And a lot of people didn't like that. They called, Georgetown basketball, as, thugs and all that. This is basically code word for N-word. You know what I mean? But, John Thompson never wavered. He never backed down from anything. And, he basically embraced the kind of criticism because if another team was playing the same way as Georgetown was, they would have gotten praise for that. You know what I mean? And certainly, John Thompson was a huge proponent of just playing honest basketball and not being afraid to, get in your face and challenge you physically. You know what I mean? That's what Georgetown basketball was all about. But he was much more than that. And he was responsible for helping the careers of Patrick Ewing, Reggie Williams, sleep before get into the NBA. Dikembe Mutombo, Alonzo Mourning, but also my favorite one was Allen Iverson. And for all of you guys that know Allen Iverson's story, you would know what he went through early on in his life that pretty much almost could have, ended many people's lives, especially if you were black back in the day. And his Allen Iverson's mom wrote a letter to John Thompson, pleading and begging him to basically allow his son to play at Georgetown University. And in a sense, John Thompson gave Allen Iverson a chance, and he allowed Iverson to blossom into one of the nation's premier players. You know what I mean? And when Allen Iverson, well, went on Twitter to pretty much voice his love for and his admiration for him, this is what he pretty much Allen Iverson had to say. He said, "Thanks for saving my life, coach. I'm going to miss you, but I'm sure you are looking down on us with a big smile. I would give anything just for one more phone call from you and to hear you say, 'Hey, MF,' and then we would talk everything except basketball." Patrick Ewing, who was basically the face of Georgetown basketball, pretty much said, "Georgetown University, the sport of basketball, and the world has lost someone who I consider to be the father figure, a confidant, and a role model. We will all miss you, Coach John Thompson, but we will never forget you." Okay, and Alonzo Mourning even pretty much said on his Twitter page, he said, "Coach, thank you for everything, and I will always honor you by paying it forward. I love you. Rest in peace." And then Dikembe Mutombo, made a post on Instagram, pretty much saying, and quote, "Very sad news to wake up on this cloudy morning. Our legendary Georgetown coach John Thompson has passed away. He was my mentor, great teacher, hero, and a father figure to so many of us who got the chance to play for him. Under Coach Thompson, I learned a lot about the game of basketball, but most importantly, I learned how to be a man in society. We will really miss him. Rest in peace, Coach." You know, all these different messages really kind of illustrate to you how much of a figure he was. But the stories about John Thompson were just far more than just about the father figure, stuff. But he was a guy that he really loved his players so much. And this is the type of story that I think not many people have touched upon, yesterday. But I am going to in this case. And this goes back to in the late 80s, okay? During, Alonzo Mourning's, freshman year, I believe. Um, John Thompson got word that Rayful Edmond III, who was basically a notorious drug dealer and basically a drug kingpin in the DC area, was going to meet up with several of his players, which also included Alonzo Mourning. And during that time, Edmond III was pretty much friendly with several of the players. And when John Thompson basically got the word of what was going to go out, he sent the word through his sources that to have Edmond meet him in his office at the Mc, at the McDonald gymnasium. When basically Rainbow Edmond III arrived, Johnson initially got cordial and informed Edmond that he needed to cease all contacts with his players and 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 post haste, especially John Turner and Alonzo Mourning, both of them that basically were friends with Edmond at the time. And when Edmond tried to explain that that Mourning and a couple of his players were not doing anything illegal, that's when John Thompson, the big figure of John Thompson, stood up from his chair, pointed his index finger between Edmond's eyes, and known for his hot volatile and bold anger, he basically lashed out at Edmond and said and basically told him that he did not care about his crew's violent reputation or propensity to commit murder, and that Edmond had crossed the line with Thompson's player, and he was not going to allow Edmond, basically Mr. Edmond, to ruin the players' lives. And because of that, Edmond III never associated with another Hoya player again on any personal level. And it was to believe that Thompson was the only player, the only person to stand up to Raymond Edmond III without any consequence. Because let me tell y'all something, okay? Go look up his name. That guy was basically a dangerous man. And for John Thompson to have the courage to stand up to a drug lord and pretty much told them to stay the hell away from our players because you're not going to ruin their lives. pretty much spoke volumes about how much he cared about his basketball players and how much he valued them as his own kids. I'm telling you, Mourning it will be forever grateful for John Thompson for what he did for him on that particular day. Because if this weren't anyone else, they'd be dead. Trust me. But for John Thompson to do that spoke about volumes about the curves of this man. But also it didn't end there because during during probably the same year in 1989, before they were supposed to play against Boston College, another Big East rival. Um, Basically, John Thompson was against the rule of Proposition 48 by the NCAA, which basically prohibited scholarship athletes from playing their freshman years if they failed to qualify academically. Well, John Thompson knew that was basically a load of crap because a lot of his players were succeeding academically, but they were still violating the rules of Proposition 48. And John Thompson basically gave them the middle finger and basically walked off the court and gave his assistant coach Mike Riley the head coaching duties to protest Proposition 48. I'm telling you, these are the kind of things that really made John Thompson a beloved but makes basically a bold figure in the world of college basketball. You know, it spoke volumes of what the man stood for. And he eventually he continued coaching Georgetown until 1999 when he basically resigned from coaching, due to family issues. And after that, he became a broadcaster for Turner Sports and had one of the best, three-man booths, in all of the NBA when you had Kevin Harlan, Danny Ainge, and John Thompson. And John Thompson, during the live telecast was always a guy that always stood up for the big men. You know what I'm saying? He was always a guy that always stood up for the big guys in terms of their physicalness and all that because he understood the physical necessity for big men. And so he was always a guy that stood up for that and always approached every single broadcast with the same bold figurativeness and the same preparation that he used to do when he was a head coach. And he had great interviews with Michael Jordan, Rasheed Wallace, including the infamous interview with Vince Carter too. All these kind of things, really showed how much John Thompson was well diverse and not just in broadcasting, but in terms of, you know, uh, understanding players. But after that, he retired from broadcasting and basically was helped out, in radio broadcasting too. But he was going through some health issues, over the last couple of years. But as of now, his cause of death is still unknown at this particular point in time. But the thing that I appreciate about John Thompson was is that this was a guy that was never afraid to speak his mind, and he had any answer that he wanted to answer. If he had any question that he had needed to answer, he was willing to say it with no consequence. There was no holding back with John Thompson. Okay, anything that he had on his mind, any particular subject or any racial issue that needed to be addressed, he basically spoke it, and he didn't care what anyone else thought. And those are the kind of people that you need to have, to basically be at the forefront of civil rights and for equality for Black people. And that's what to me John Thompson stood up more than anything else. Besides the winnings, besides the wins, besides the championships and the great players that he helped mentor, and he helped mentor Ewing, Mutombo, Mourning, and Iverson into the Hall of Fame. The thing that I will always respect about John Thompson was is that he was a guy that was never afraid to speak his mind and was never afraid of the consequences of his rhetoric. And those are the kind of people that you need to have in these times. And he's certainly going to be missed in the world of college basketball. The great rivalries, in the 80s with, St. John's, Syracuse, you know what I'm saying? All these great rivalries, including with Villanova as well. I mean, that's what made college basketball the greatest thing ever since. The 80s, like I said, the 80s of college basketball cannot be understated enough. It was the greatest period of college basketball ever. You know what I'm saying? And for John Thompson to build that Georgetown program into one of the great blue bloods of college basketball is one of the greatest transformations there's too. You know what I'm saying? Kind of almost similar to what I talked about with Lou Olson when he basically built Arizona into one of the premier college programs in the country. You know what I'm saying? And I remembered, you know, listening to Shaq on Inside the NBA and thinking about how if he didn't have, if it, Dale Brown didn't approach him to come to LSU, he would have had no problem coming to Georgetown because of John Thompson. And when you talk to a lot of his other players, you know, they pretty much will tell you that they all went to Georgetown not because of the university, because they wanted to play for, you know, John Thompson because of everything that he stood for, but also the ability to basically make his guys not just from kids, but to find young men. And that's what he'll definitely miss the most. So RIP to John Thompson. You know, my heart and condolences go out to him and his family. You know what I mean? And even though that he's gone from this earth, the legacy and the impact that he made on all these men that he helped mentor into the Hall of Fame will never, ever be forgotten. Rest in peace, John Thompson Jr.